Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Michael Niedrich, and I am the co-CEO of Amerivet Securities. As always, it's my pleasure to be joined by my partner, Gregory Faranello, CFA, all things rates, Fed, and liquidity. And we have a special guest today, Greg, our first-time repeat guest, Ira Jersey. So, Ira, thanks for joining us today.
Thank you.
Gentlemen, I can say this, in all the years Greg and I have had the pleasure of doing this together, this is probably going to be one of the most anticipated Fed meetings ever. So with that, Greg, as I always say, I'm smart enough to let the pros do what they do. So I'll throw it to you and Ira and enjoy the conversation.
All right. Thank you very much, Michael. Ira, it's great to have you back. We value the work that you and Angelo and the team do at Bloomberg. And it's great to have you ahead of, like Michael said, a very hot and anticipated Fed meeting. So we'll talk about a bunch of things and we'll dive into it for sake of time. I thought first, we'd start, and I'd love to get your thoughts. I mean, there's been a ton of communication since the last Fed meeting. And we certainly had the hearings for both Chair Powell and Fed Governor Brainard, and we had the Fed minutes. So I'd really love to get your thoughts on that sort of in between Fed speak, and then maybe some thoughts on the Fed minutes in general as a powerful tool here going forward, especially as we start to talk about balance sheet runoff.
Yeah, it's interesting. So when the Fed switched about a decade or so ago from giving the Fed minutes instead of 2 weeks after the next meeting, they started doing it 3 weeks after the current meeting, which is, great for market participants, I think, because they're just giving more color. It was a very useful tool because you got hints as to how members of the Fed were thinking. Now it's interesting because there are still tidbits in the minutes that matter, but with the post meeting press conference at every single meeting now, it's a little bit less surprising in general. So we wind up having to focus a lot on the nuance. Like for example, Greg, one of the things that I think has been underappreciated by a lot of the economics types that I think was very important in the last reading of the minutes was this line that it says some members of the Federal Reserve are concerned that tighter monetary policy will lead to too much curve flattening, and they'd like to use the balance sheet to counteract some of those effects. And then while other members said that the staff doesn't know how interest rates move, which probably is true to some degree. They don't obviously read your musings on LinkedIn or my Bloomberg articles quite enough to if they did, they'd probably understand it better. But the point is that it's those little kinds of nuances like that, is things like the Federal Reserve and even if it's not a majority of the members of the Fed, the fact that there's a few members or some members in this case that are worried about yield curve and yield curve inversion, I think that's very telling, because one of the things that means is that there are at least some members who don't want to hike too fast. Because if the Fed hikes too fast, they will invert the yield curve earlier than what's currently priced. So, you and I talk all the time about forward rates and what the market's pricing. And right now, the market is pricing for the yield curve to be pancake flat in 2024. So the thing is, if they hike, and that's based, remember, on the Fed only hiking 6 or 7 times. So if the Fed goes more than what's priced this year, then that means you're going to get inversion, and you're going to get inversion probably much sooner than you would. And that's, just a sign that the Fed's made a policy error or is in the process of making a policy error.
No, that's interesting. I mean, we certainly talked about the yield curve. I think the debate around the yield curve right now is probably one of the more interesting ones, with the market trying to figure out, will balance sheet runoff replace rate hikes potentially going forward? And with that, so heading into Wednesday, I mean, what are your thoughts? Right, we'll have the statement, obviously, and then we're going to have Powell's press conference. There's been talk in the marketplace across the board. They can drop the taper this week. They could potentially hike this week, hike 50 in March. So it's really been all over the map, and certainly it's impacting risk assets too, I believe, short term. What are your thoughts heading into Wednesday more specifically?
Yeah, so the statement I think will basically be a sign that that yes, they are incrementally more hawkish, but I don't think there's going to be that many changes. There'll be some, acknowledgement that inflation remains, maybe a little bit higher than they had anticipated, like maybe it's frustratingly high or something like that. But I think Chair Powell's press conference will be vitally important to the path of monetary policy going forward. So I think it'll make it clear that there's two things: is that one, they want to hike, and they are worried about some of the risk assets in the market and the signal that the markets might be telling them right now. And I think that's one of the reasons, as you correctly state, Greg, that the markets swooning as we talk right now. S&P 500 is off more than 2% today, right? And part of that is just a realization that the Fed almost has to hike because of the path of inflation, and that is one of their two mandates is definitively not being met right now. But the risk is for them, I think, is that is the pacing and the timing of how they hike. So if they hike in March, first, I think that Jay Powell will make it pretty clear that they're going to move not at a measured pace necessarily, but he'll say that we're not going to spook the market. If he's asked, like, are you guys considering 50 basis points? He'll say something like we're not going to take anything off the table, because they always say that, right? Keep the optionality available. But they'll say we're not taking anything off the table, but it would be pretty unusual for us to, do that as a first step, right? So something like that. So then we'll completely price out, although we have today already priced out a 50 basis point hike at the next meeting. But they'll hike in March, and then I think the question then becomes, which he won't answer definitively, but Chair Powell and as well as the minutes state very, very succinctly that the Fed wants to start runoff very soon after they start hiking. So one of the clever, I don't want to say clever, but one of the things that they can do to signal that to the market that they're serious about getting inflation under control, and at the same time signaling that they're not necessarily going to hike every meeting, would be to skip May and instead announce balance sheet runoff in May. So basically say that, hey, we're gonna do something hawkish, but we're not necessarily raising interest rates at every single meeting. And so the thing to listen for as Jay Powell talks on Wednesday afternoon at 2:30 is, does he and the rest of the Fed see that balance sheet runoff as potentially replacing some hikes? Because if that's the case, then I think you have to reassess the pace of hikes for 2022 in particular, and then also maybe a little bit more in 23. And I think my personal read on this is, if they do that, and they skip May and they only go, say, 3 times this year, which would be slower than what the market's currently pricing, then they could probably go more, because then the curve won't invert so quickly. The curve will stay reasonably steep. It might not completely destroy demand while inflation is still coming down at a nice pace from the incredibly lofty levels where it is. But there is a risk, right? And the risk is that Jay Powell comes out and says, hey, we're fighting inflation now. That's all we're thinking about right now. We're not thinking about anything else. And if that's the case, then all bets are off. They might go 5 or 6 times, and the curve will invert this year, and we'll be in a recession next year. And that's the reality of the situation, I think.
Yeah, no, I mean, like those are great points. Like Michael said, I mean, where the whole world is going to be watching this meeting with anticipation and trying to find little clues and tidbits like that, which kind of takes me to, I think, in this marketplace, give credit where credit is due. I think you've had one of the best calls on the balance sheet out there, and I follow a lot of people, as you know, and I'd love for you to talk a little bit about your ideas, more specifically in terms of runoff, because I know you guys have put out some great pieces, some great research, some great charts, one in particular, which I love. So what are your thoughts really for our listeners and clients with regard to that runoff? How could that potentially look now relative to, say, the last tightening cycle?
Well, so firstly, this will happen much sooner, right? They've already signaled that they're going to start runoff much sooner than they did last time. Last time they waited basically a year from the time that they started to hike in 2016 to the time they started runoff. This time I think they'll go much sooner, and I think that they'll start much larger. I mean, partially they're going to start larger because the balance sheet is so much larger, but I think in particular they can probably afford at this point to run off the balance sheet very quickly. Our kind of base case scenario is $90 to $100 million per month. Sounds like a big number. It is a big number, but keep in mind that they've been buying $120 billion of assets every month since May of 2020. And then they bought a couple of $1 trillion or a little over $1 trillion before that in 2 months, right? So when we talk about this running off of the balance sheet, the pace is important. The timing of start is, if it's May or July, probably doesn't really matter that much. And I think that that's the two most likely at this point. But if they start big, we have to remember that's not necessarily a proper tightening of financial conditions and financial market liquidity the way that it would be if there wasn't so much excess liquidity in the world. So the way that I look at this, and I'm going to editorialize here a little bit, right? It's not my job to tell the Fed what they do or what they did wrong or anything else. But we were suggesting way back in the second quarter of last year that they should have been starting taper right at that point, because it was very obvious then that the financial markets and the financial sector didn't need all of the liquidity that they were continuing to pump into the market. And that's one of the reasons why they created this reverse repo facility to mop up all of the excess liquidity. And right now it's about $1.7 trillion. So let me say that again, 1.7 trillion, right? So you're talking about a huge number. And that's basically the excess liquidity that's currently in the financial sector. And until that runs off, and until the RRP facility, the reverse repo facility, isn't used anymore, I would argue that the financial sector has more than enough liquidity, and the Fed won't actually be effectively tightening financial conditions until they get below that. So that's one reason why they should go very early. In fact, I'm going to give a shout out to someone who I don't think they're going to do this, but one of the things that my friend Mark Cabana over at Bank of America suggested was that they could just run off their treasury bill portfolio. So these are the very short-term instruments. They have about $317 billion of them, and they can just roll them off in 2 months and try to get the RP facility down very quickly. I don't think that they'll do that because the Fed tends to be much more measured than that. But it's still at $100 billion a month. I mean, that's still a pretty good clip. And allowing that to run off over the course of a year and get that RRP facility down would probably be in their best interest to do that early. And I think that they're considering that. So that's something else to listen for. Jay Powell is going to be asked, like, hey, when you do this, how are you going to actually conduct runoff? Because there are many different ways that you can do it. I mean, the piece that I think you're referencing that I wrote a couple of weeks ago is only one possible way that the Fed could run off its balance sheet. There's 3 or 4, very high probability ways that they could do it.
No, that's great. I appreciate that. Do you think there's any chance they come in this week and say no more? We're done with asset purchases here?
That's possible, but just last week you had the New York Fed President John Williams say that they were going to announce that purchases would be coming to an end next month. So I doubt it, right? Like that would have been the perfect opportunity for a very high level and permanent voting member of the FOMC to make a comment like that they were going to run off, just stop and go cold turkey. Is that a signal of anything if they were to do it? I think it would just be a signal that they know that they went too far. Sure. But quite frankly, the way that they kind of operate, I doubt that they would do it at this point because, Angela mentioned this to me earlier this week. Like, if they were going to go cold turkey, they probably would have told us, like at the Chair Powell's confirmation, or like Williams would have mentioned it, something like that. None of them have. So I think that they'll continue to do one more month of the smallish asset purchases.
Yeah, no, that's fair. I think even Chair Powell did say at his hearing that he anticipates purchases ending in March. But I bring that up because it is out there, certainly. But I agree. I mean, this Fed is not into surprising markets at all. So signaling, communication has been critical. Well, that's great. Mike, I'm going to pass it back to you to see if you have anything else for Ira or potentially myself.
I have to tell you, I always like to ask a question. I won't ask it to Ira, but I will ask it to you, Greg.
Oh boy,
how many times do you think they raised this year? I'll put you on the spot.
Yeah, I think they're setting up for 4 rate hikes. I think their baseline right now is 3. I think what you'll see in March, you'll get another summary of economic projections. And I think the Fed is they're going to Ira's point, and I agree, I think they're going to tighten in March. They'll signal 4 hikes for 2022 in total with that SCP. But I think Ira is spot on. I think they're going to use the balance sheet more aggressive this time around.
That makes a lot of sense. Listen, guys, I will tell you, I've been in this business a lot of years, but I always get highly educated when you two discuss this, and it's an important time, and it really is, and people need to lock in and understand, and to have your both your valuable insights is fantastic. So I just want to, again, Ira, thank you for joining us again. We look forward to having you in the future. And Greg, always amazing. It's hard to believe how long you and I have been doing this at this point, bud. So thanks again, gentlemen, and I wish everyone a great day. Thank you.